The coroner didn't mince words. He couldn't say who the man was. He didn't know the cause of death, nor whether it had been a murder. A nurse named Jessica Thompson had been able to see the face of this unknown man. The young woman seemed unsettled. Her eyes widened. She trembled slightly, turned her gaze away and refused to look at him again. She seemed so shaken that those around her thought she might faint. It gave the impression that she recognized him. As she wiped away sweat, they waited impatiently for her to say his name. But instead, she swore she didn't know who the man was, claimed she had never seen him before. Still, it was obvious she seemed to know something. She was about to get married. Perhaps he was an ex-boyfriend she wanted to forget. They thought that in time she would tell them who he was, but she never did. If she knew something, or if her reaction was purely involuntary, she took it to her grave. They first saw him at 7 in the evening on the last day of November in 1948. It was a warm day, and John Lyons and his wife had decided to take a walk along Somerton beach. During their walk, John noticed a man lying on the sand. And he remembered him clearly because he was fully dressed in a suit and shoes, an unusual outfit for lying on the beach. The man in the suit seemed to be raising his hand, as if pointing toward the sky, but neither John nor his wife could tell what he meant to do. They assumed he was drunk and trying to smoke a cigarette. Whatever the case, they paid him no more attention and continued their walk. About half an hour later, another couple passed the same spot and stopped for a moment to look at him. This time he seemed not to be moving. They weren't entirely sure. His left arm was stretched out over the sand, and mosquitoes and flies hovered around his face. The man in the couple joked that he would have to be dead not to notice the insect bites. The next morning, John returned to the beach for a swim and saw a crowd gathered around the man. This time it was clear. He hadn't been drunk or asleep. He had died before he could finish the last cigarette he had struggled to bring to his mouth. In his pockets they found matches, a comb, an unused train ticket, a used bus ticket, cigarettes, a cigarette resting on his ear, a pack of chewing gum, but no identification. It seemed he had planned to take the train but was delayed and ended up taking the bus instead, which stopped a kilometer away. He wasn't wearing a hat, a detail that might not stand out today but was common at the time, especially with a suit. His shoes were shiny, freshly polished. And one more thing, every clothing label had been cut out. There were no visible injuries. His hands were clean, with no marks, in fact well cared for. That suggested he had no occupation involving manual labor, or if he once had, he hadn't done it for a long time. At the hospital, after a thorough examination, they found several organs filled with blood, showing clear signs of poisoning, yet he had not vomited even once, which was unusual if he had been lying on the beach for hours. Stranger still, if indeed he had all the signs of poisoning, the tests couldn't find any trace of poison in his body, no matter how many they performed. Another coroner, Thomas Cleland, continued to believe it was poison, but one of the type that leaves no trace because it breaks down quickly, such as strophanthine. Even if that was the case, they could never know how the poison had entered his body, whether he had taken it himself or someone else had administered it. What could be deduced was that he or someone else wanted to leave the fewest possible traces, choosing an invisible poison, not hard to obtain at least at the time, but one that hinted at a certain professionalism. Invisibility was, in fact, a recurring theme in this case. It was as if someone who had never existed had died in physical form. Physically, he had small peculiarities, just strange enough to stand out. His spleen was 3 times its normal size. His pupils, on the other hand, were unusually small. And finally, the toes on his feet tapered to a point, the kind of shape left after years of wearing narrow, pointed shoes. At first, the best they could do was keep the body in storage. From time to time, someone would come forward, believing they recognized him, usually a missing relative, but identification always ruled them out. This was the first dead end. They had no name and no poison. Motivated perhaps by the bus ticket and his suit, they thought he might have been traveling and thus might have left luggage somewhere. They searched within several kilometers, in hotels, bus stations, train stations, anywhere someone might have left personal belongings. That's when they found his suitcase. It was in the left luggage office at Adelaide railway station. It had been deposited there the same day he was seen on the beach, and no one had come back for it since. The station employees couldn't confirm whether the man on the beach was the same one who had left it. And as if the case were turning into some sort of unfunny joke, nothing inside the suitcase revealed who its owner was. There were a pair of slippers, a dressing gown, socks, underwear, pajamas, a screwdriver, a jacket manufactured in the United States. Remember, we are in Australia, and shaving equipment, among other items. Some pieces of clothing did have a name sewn into them. A tie labeled T. Keen and Keen stitched into a vest. Apparently, he had left those names in place because removing them would have damaged the garments. Even so, if he hadn't gotten rid of them, it was because he wasn't actually T. Keen. This detail about names and clothing needs explaining. It was 1948, a difficult year. World War II had ended, but the Cold War had begun a year earlier. Political tensions and economic instability had caused shortages in Australia and elsewhere. It was common practice to put one's name on clothing because garments, like food, were rationed. Each adult had 112 clothing coupons a year, 2 ration books, in fact. By the time they found the man on the beach, that law had been abolished for 6 months, but half a year was too short for full transition. Many still had their names sewn into clothing or had purchased second-hand garments with the previous owner's name still on them. That's why many people cut the labels, because that was where the name was usually sewn. And if they didn't, as in the case of the tie, it was because it had been stitched in such a way that removing it could damage the item. Returning to the suitcase, the T. Keen sewn into the tie, as promising as it might have seemed, led to the second dead end. No one with that name could be connected to the man. The jacket made in the United States raised another question. Had he come from there? Did he know someone who brought in clothes from the US? The questions multiplied, while answers were scarce. Months passed, and John Cleland requested a re-examination of all the evidence. That's when they found something incredible. In the man's pants, there was a very small, almost hidden inner pocket containing a scrap of paper with a phrase in Persian, "Tamam shud." The truth is, the first examination hadn't been very thorough, but assigning blame could wait. For now, they had a new lead. Reporter Frank Kennedy recognized the fragment and told police it came from a book of poetry called The Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. Finding a copy of the book was easy. The complicated, mysterious part was that they couldn't locate an edition that matched the fragment exactly. In this case, even the smallest clue had to be elusive and complicated. A tiny scrap of paper turned into a puzzle. While the search continued, the press offered interpretations of the fragment's literal meaning, ended, suggesting it might be the farewell of a man who no longer knew how to go on. A rushed goodbye. But as I said, speculation was the best anyone could do, and the few available clues led nowhere. After that, the body was finally buried. If you think everything up to this point was strange and couldn't get any stranger, wait and listen. 3 months after the note was found, a man nervously approached the police carrying a copy of the exact edition they had been looking for. That alone might have seemed like a miracle, but he also said the note they had found had been torn from this very book. He told them that 8 months earlier, around the time the man was found on the beach, he had discovered the book in the back seat of his car. Since he was with his brother-in-law at the time, he assumed it belonged to him, and the brother-in-law assumed it was his. They put it in the glove compartment, and there it stayed. He hadn't thought about it until he saw in the newspaper that the police were looking for that specific edition. Only then did they examine it closely and notice the missing page, making it clear it had not belonged to either of them. Apparently, someone had simply left the book in his car. Given the model of the vehicle, it wasn't suspicious that someone could have placed it there. The car was often left unlocked. And officially, the case wasn't being treated as a homicide. There was no reason to think the man was a suspect. It made no sense for someone to bring them a piece of evidence that could incriminate him if he were guilty. In any case, they examined the book carefully and found, written on the back, 2 phone numbers. One belonged to a bank. The other belonged to nurse Jessica Thompson. When they contacted her and asked why her number was in that book, she told them that long ago, She had met a man she had fallen in love with and had given him that book. His name was Alfred Boxall. The brief excitement of thinking they had solved the case ended quickly when they learned it couldn't have been Alfred. Among other small details, he was still alive. He still had the copy she had given him, and his book had no missing pages. What were the odds that she had given the same edition of the book to two different people who weren't connected to each other? They returned to speak with Jessica, this time bringing the plaster cast of the man's face, and that's when the scene from the beginning took place. Despite her evident nervousness, the impression she might faint at any moment, and the way she quickly averted her eyes so she wouldn't have to look at him, she swore she didn't know who he was. She also admitted that about a year earlier, her neighbors had told her that a man had been looking for her, but they couldn't remember his face and he hadn't given his name. The book, one that spoke of living life to the fullest without regrets, still held another secret. A code that was only visible under ultraviolet light. It was a series of letters written in 4 lines, with the first 2 lines separated from the rest by 2 horizontal marks. The crossed-out section appeared to be a mistake because if you looked closely, the 3rd line began the same way. ML. This code has passed through the hands of the greatest experts in cryptography and military intelligence, and they have never been able to decipher it. To this day, no one knows what it says, if it says anything at all, or if it's just a random sequence of letters. And so, in such an unusual way, they realized there was nothing more they could do. They didn't know who he was, how he died, why he was on the beach, what the code meant, or why the nurse had reacted the way she did. They didn't know if he had taken the poison himself or if someone had silenced him. Many questions, yes, but together they left very few real possibilities. First, we have to consider that, deep down, I think he did it himself. Think about it. He dies lying on the beach, near a woman who clearly seems to recognize him, with a note in his pocket reading, "Ended." It's a scene that feels almost too romantic. Why would someone else go to the trouble of taking him to the beach, slipping the note into a hidden inner pocket, and leaving a book with a phone number that led directly to a woman who appeared to know him? That would contradict the subtlety of using an untraceable poison while at the same time leaving an even bigger clue. So, let's suppose he did it himself. Why? And why use an invisible poison? The nurse once said she was very grateful to have met her husband. She said that because they had a child together, but the child was not his. She had conceived it with another man. It's more than believable that this other man was the Somerton man. That would explain her reaction and her refusal to acknowledge him. Perhaps she thought that if she admitted it, she would lose her husband. Who knows? Maybe she met him during the war, and they spent time together before separating. If the man her neighbors had seen was him, it might have been an attempt to see her again, or to see his child, and he could have become depressed when he discovered she was married. A year later, he tears out the page, dresses in a suit, shines his shoes, and takes poison on the beach. A realistic version. But why didn't he have any identification? And why use that type of poison? Those 2 details are what make the imagination run wild and give rise to the theory that he was a spy, someone for whom hiding his identity was vital. Dramatic as it may sound, it could make some sense, or even fit within the same framework. Let's keep assuming he met the nurse and had a child with her. If he was working undercover, being with her would have made him vulnerable. That book, so unique, so suspicious, despite all efforts, there was no other exactly like it, not to mention the code written inside. More than just a book, it seemed like a unique and indecipherable channel of communication. This romance theory is supported by the fact that when Jessica's son grew up, he appeared to have physical features similar to those of the Somerton man, especially his teeth and ears. These characteristics seem to strongly suggest he was his father. The truth may finally be known when Professor Derek Abbott completes DNA testing with Rachel Egan, who is the nurse's granddaughter, and, if the hypothesis is correct, the Somerton man's granddaughter as well. That would confirm the theory of an impossible romance, though we would still never know his real name. A man in love who, for some reason, could not see his son, whether because she rejected him or because he couldn't. would be the ideal solution, if not for one final detail. While reviewing the police statements archived in 1959, Private Detective Jerry Feltus found one that had been overlooked. On that day at Somerton Beach, a witness claimed to have seen a man carrying another person over his shoulder near the shoreline, in the very same spot where, the next day, the man who never existed would be found.